Gulf Coast, Florida. A woman is standing in the dark, watching her life be dismantled. The evening heat presses against the windows, but inside the air is cold with betrayal. My name is Abigail Hayes, and I am listening from the hallway as my family toasts to my financial ruin. There are no intruders breaking down the door, only my parents and sister sitting on my couch, casually discussing how to forge my signature and bulldoze my sanctuary. They believe I am their helpless safety net. They think I am asleep, but I am wide awake, and I am about to turn their ambush into a trap. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. Here is my story. The wood of the front porch was cool beneath my bare feet, a grounding sensation I looked forward to every single day. I stood there with a glass of ice water in my hand, watching the Florida sun dip below the horizon, painting the Gulf Coast sky in bruising shades of purple and orange. This was my ritual. This was my peace. But more importantly, this was mine. My name was on the deed, Abigail Hayes, and that piece of paper meant more to me than any diploma or accolade. I looked at the renovated craftsman bungalow behind me, taking in the fresh coat of sage green paint and the oversized windows I'd paid to have restored. To anyone driving by, it was just a charming house in a quiet neighborhood. To me, it was the physical manifestation of my entire 20s. I hadn't spent the last decade partying in Tulum or backpacking through Europe. I had spent it working 2 jobs, eating instant ramen 4 nights a week, and driving a sedan that rattled every time it went over 40 miles per hour. I had dug myself out of student debt without a single handout, scraped together a down payment through freelance graphic design gigs and sleepless nights, and finally bought my freedom. That's what this house was. It wasn't just shelter. It was a fortress against the chaos I had grown up in. I loved this neighborhood. I loved that the retired couple next door, the Millers, waved to me every morning. I loved that Dave, the firefighter across the street, kept an eye on my mailbox, and that the barista 3 blocks away knew my order by heart. I had built a life of stability, brick by brick. My phone buzzed in my pocket, shattering the moment. I didn't need to look to know it was likely my mother, Linda. My parents, Mark and Linda, still lived in Ohio, perpetually one bad decision away from financial ruin. For years, I had been the silent safety net, sending $600 or $800 a month to cover a broken furnace or a medical bill that somehow never had paperwork attached. I had even paid for my younger sister Riley's car repairs and tuition gaps. They praised me for being the responsible one, the good daughter. But underneath the praise was a simmering resentment that I had dared to leave. They acted as if my moving away was a personal insult, an abandonment of the sinking ship they insisted on captaining. I went inside to reheat some leftover pasta, the silence of the house wrapping around me like a warm blanket. It was Friday night. My plan involved a glass of wine, a book, and absolutely no drama. But just as the microwave beeped, the doorbell rang. It wasn't the polite chime of a neighbor returning a package. It was a rapid-fire assault on the button. I wiped my hands on a towel, confused. I wasn't expecting anyone. I unlocked the door and swung it open, prepared to politely dismiss a solicitor. Instead, the breath left my lungs. Standing on my welcome mat were my parents, Riley and Riley's husband, Damon Price. They were surrounded by 4 massive rolling suitcases and a cloud of travel exhaustion. Before I could even form a word, Damon pushed past me, his shoulder brushing mine with a casual arrogance that set my teeth on edge. "Surprise family weekend," he announced, his voice booming in my small entryway. "Florida in February, we just had to." "What?" I stammered, stepping back as my parents hauled their bags over the threshold. "What are you doing here? You didn't call." "Oh, Abby, don't be like that," my mother said, dropping her purse on the floor and pulling me into a hug that felt more like a capture than an embrace. "We missed you. We needed a break from the cold." Riley didn't hug me. She tossed her designer tote onto my pristine beige sofa and immediately started scanning the room. "It's cute," she said, her tone dripping with judgment, "but so much wasted space with this layout. You could really modernize this if you weren't so attached to the whole old charm thing." Damon didn't even take his shoes off. He walked straight through the living room and out onto the back deck, staring at the small private dock and the water beyond like a contractor sizing up a demolition job. My heart hammered against my ribs. The shift was instantaneous. 5 minutes ago, this was my sanctuary. Now it felt like occupied territory. Dinner was a blur of forceful improvisation. I threw together what I had, but the micro-betrayals started before we even sat down. Damon took the seat at the head of the table, my seat, without asking. Then I heard the pop of a cork. I turned to see him pouring generous glasses of the 2018 Cabernet Sauvignon I had been saving for 3 years, waiting for the day I landed the senior director promotion I was gunning for. "Nice vintage," he said, taking a swig like it was box wine. "So let's talk equity." I stared at the wine, feeling a prick of tears I refused to shed. Equity. "Abby, a place like this is wasted on just one person," Damon said, leaning back, expanding into the space. I was looking at the lot lines. You could easily carve off the back lot, put up a modern rental unit over the water, a duplex maybe. Let me handle the whole thing. Your parents could finally breathe with that kind of income. You'd still clear 6 figures. "We're drowning in bills, honey," my father added through a mouthful of pasta, not meeting my eyes. "We sacrificed everything so you kids could have more. It's hard to see you sitting on a gold mine while we're struggling to keep the lights on." "Family helps family," my mother murmured, a phrase she used like a weapon. I felt backed into a corner in my own kitchen. The guilt was a heavy, familiar weight, but for the first time it was mixed with a sharp, hot spike of anger. They hadn't come to visit me. They had come to harvest me. As we were cleaning up, the final blow landed. Riley leaned against the counter, checking her nails. "Oh, by the way, Damon gets up early. He likes a full breakfast spread. Eggs, bacon, fruit, the works. We'll need it ready at 5 a.m. You can do that, right? You're the homeowner, you know where everything is." My parents nodded in agreement, as if this were the most natural request in the world, as if I were the staff. I stared at them, the pulse in my neck visible in the reflection of the microwave. They were trying to erase my boundaries just like they always did. I forced a smile that felt like it might crack my face. "Sure," I said, my voice steady. "I'll take care of everything." I turned away, looking at the clock on the stove. The word everything echoed in my head, transforming from a promise into something much darker. The next morning, the sun had barely crested the horizon, but I had already been awake for 2 hours, performing the role of the dutiful daughter. After a breakfast that I had scrambled to throw together, which was consumed with minimal thanks and maximum critique, Damon clapped his hands and announced it was time for a family summit. I was herded into my own living room like a junior employee being called in for a performance review. The coffee table, usually home to a stack of art books and a singular succulent, was now buried under a chaotic spread of glossy brochures, architectural mock-ups, and spreadsheets printed in tiny, dense font. Damon stood in the center of the rug, commanding the room. He picked up a rendering of a sleek, glass-walled structure hovering over the water, my water. "You've built something amazing here, Abby," he started, his voice dripping with a salesman's practiced warmth. "Truly, but it's raw potential. With my help, this place could actually work for the whole family, instead of just sitting here accumulating equity you can't touch." My parents sat on the sofa, nodding in unison like bobbleheads. My mother, Linda, leaned forward, her face etched with a tragic sort of hope. "We're not getting any younger, honey. Your father's back is getting worse by the day. Social Security barely stretches to cover the groceries, let alone the medical bills. We're just asking you to consider it. We're family." "Abby, look," my father, Mark, chimed in, his voice gruff and heavy with implied obligation. "We sacrificed so much for you. I worked double shifts at the plant. Your mom went without new clothes for a decade so you kids could go to college. This is how you can pay it forward. It's the right thing to do." I sat in the armchair, clutching my coffee mug with white knuckles. The air in the room felt stifling. Before I could respond, Damon casually slid a heavy leather folder across the table toward me. It stopped inches from my hand. "Just a preliminary authorization," he said lightly, as if asking for a signature on a birthday card. It just allows me to talk to some lenders and contractors on your behalf. Get the ball rolling. You don't have to commit to the build yet, but we need to move fast on the financing. I opened the folder. I wasn't a lawyer, but I had read enough contracts in my freelance work to know when language was dangerous. My eyes snagged on phrases that made my stomach turn: limited power of attorney, right to encumber, transfer of interest. This wasn't a permission slip for a contractor, this was a surrender of control. You live here alone, Abby? Riley interrupted, her voice shrill from the corner where she was scrolling on her phone. You don't even want kids. What do you need all this space for? Let the house do something for Mom and Dad. Honestly, it's selfish to sit on all this asset value when they're struggling. The word selfish hit me like a physical slap. I was single not by choice, but because I had spent a decade grinding, working 60-hour weeks to get financially stable so I wouldn't end up like them. I remembered the checks I sent when the furnace broke in Ohio. I remembered paying for the procedure Dad needed for his knee. I remembered bailing Riley's car out of repossession last year. I wasn't their daughter anymore. I had become the default solution to everyone else's bad choices. I muttered something about needing to think about it and retreated to the kitchen to refill the coffee pot, my hands shaking. The living room grew quiet, voices dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I paused the carafe in my hand and strained to listen. Once the paperwork is done, she can't back out. I heard my mother say, her voice low but distinct. It's not like we're stealing Mark. We're just making sure she doesn't make a stupid decision and erase all this potential. She doesn't understand business. Don't worry, Damon answered, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. Legally speaking, we can practically erase her from the equation on the back lot once the zoning is approved. It'll just look like a family trust. She won't even notice until it's too late to stop it. Erase. The word repeated in my head, bouncing around my skull. They didn't just want help. They wanted to consume my life to extend theirs. They viewed my stability not as a source of pride, but as a resource to be strip-mined. The rest of the day passed in a haze of suspicion. I watched them differently now. I saw the way Damon evaluated my furniture, the way Riley sneered at my modest car. That night, as I was loading the dishwasher, Riley walked in, her earlier indifference replaced by a sharp edge. Don't forget 5 a.m. breakfast again tomorrow, she commanded, not asking. Damon has a long run scheduled. He needs real food, Abby, not your little single girl snacks. Make it hearty. From the living room, my father laughed. You always were the hostess, Abby. You'll make it nice. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I just nodded, feeling a cold, hard stone form in the center of my chest. I went to my room and closed the door, locking it for the first time in years. I sat on my bed and pulled out my phone, scrolling through my past orders until I found a product I had once bought as a joke for a cleanse years ago. Ultra Cleanse. Extra strength detox tea. The reviews were filled with horror stories of people who hadn't heeded the warnings about the intense laxative effects. I stared at the Order Now button. I looked at my reflection in the dark window. The woman staring back looked tired, yes, but the fear was gone. You ambushed me in my own home, I whispered to the empty room. I clicked Add to Cart. Same-day delivery. The estimated arrival was 4:00 a.m., just in time for breakfast. The alarm blared at 4:00 a.m., slicing through the thin layer of sleep I had managed to catch. My heart was already hammering against my ribs, an erratic rhythm of adrenaline and dread. I moved through the dark house like a ghost, or perhaps more like a machine programmed for a specific volatile task. In the kitchen, the harsh under-cabinet lighting illuminated my workspace. I started the routine, cracking eggs, slicing fruit, hearing the sizzle of bacon that Damon demanded. Then I turned my attention to the small brown box that had been delivered just a few hours ago. I opened the package of Ultra Cleanse tea. The warning label was printed in bold red text: do not exceed 1 bag per day. Consult a physician. I stared at it for a long moment, feeling the weight of the moral line I was about to step over. This wasn't poison. I wasn't trying to kill them. I just needed them out of my house. I needed the noise to stop so I could think. I grabbed 5 tea bags and dropped them into the large ceramic pot, pouring boiling water over them. I watched the liquid turn a dark, murky brown, smelling faintly of senna and aggressive herbs. It looked medicinal, almost punitive. I felt a tremor in my hand, a mix of guilt and grim satisfaction, but I didn't reach in to fish them out. At 5:00 a.m., Sharp Damon jogged into the kitchen, a towel around his neck, smelling of expensive body wash. Riley followed in her silk pajamas, looking groggy, while my parents shuffled in behind her. When Damon saw the spread, the stack of pancakes, the perfectly scrambled eggs, the carafe of juice, he clapped his hands together loud enough to make me flinch. "Now that," he boomed, "is how you treat family. See, Abby? It's not that hard to make an effort." We sat down. I picked at a piece of toast, watching them like a hawk. Linda rubbed her stomach and sighed. "My digestion has just been awful lately. Traveling always ruins me." "I made some herbal tea," I said, my voice sounding strangely calm to my own ears. "It's supposed to be really good for gut health." "Perfect," she said, pouring herself a large mug. "It looks healthy." She took a long sip, then another. Damon poured a cup too, washing down his bacon. Riley took a polite amount. They ate, they chatted about the zoning potential of my backyard, and they drank the tea. I sat there, my hands folded in my lap, waiting. It took about 40 minutes. We were clearing the plates when Damon's face suddenly went the color of old ash. He stopped mid-sentence, his hand gripping the edge of the table. Across from him, Mark started sweating profusely, beads of perspiration popping out on his forehead instantly. "I don't feel so good," Linda whispered, clutching her abdomen. Then chaos broke. It wasn't a gradual decline, it was a sudden, violent evacuation. Damon bolted for the guest bath. My father stumbled toward the powder room. Riley doubled over, gripping the counter. The sounds of plumbing roaring to life and doors slamming echoed through the bungalow. Accusations flew through the thin walls. "What did you put in that?" Riley screamed from the hallway, clutching her stomach. "Are you trying to kill us?" I acted appropriately concerned, playing the part of the worried hostess. "It was just tea. Maybe the eggs were bad. I'll call for help." When my parents' symptoms escalated to dizziness, likely from the sudden dehydration, I called 911. It was the responsible thing to do. The next hour was a blur of flashing lights. The EMTs decided to transport my parents just to be safe, citing dehydration risks for seniors. Damon and Riley, pale and furious, insisted on following the ambulance in Damon's SUV to the ER. They stormed out, leaving the front door wide open, and then silence. For the first time in 48 hours, the house was mine again. But I didn't sit down. I didn't clean up the breakfast dishes. I went straight to the guest room Damon and Riley had claimed. Damon's sleek black duffel bag sat open on the bench at the foot of the bed. I battled a wave of old-fashioned guilt. I was snooping. I was violating their privacy, but then I remembered the limited power of attorney he had tried to slide past me. I reached into the bag. Beneath a stack of gym clothes, I found a thick manila folder labeled A. Hayes, Gulf Property. I opened it and my breath hitched. Inside were aerial photos of my house, clearly taken from real estate listing sites, but also newer ones that looked like drone shots taken recently. There were architectural sketches of a 3-unit luxury rental complex that completely swallowed my backyard and required demolishing my deck. And then the documents. I found the limited power of attorney form. My parents had already signed it on page 3. But beneath that was something that made my blood run cold, a quitclaim deed. My name was typed at the top as the grantor. At the bottom there was a signature. It looked like mine, the loop of the A, the slant of the H, but I had never signed it. It was a forgery. A practiced, deliberate forgery. I turned to the desk where Damon had left his laptop. He was so arrogant, so sure of his control, he hadn't even closed the lid. It wasn't password protected. I opened his email client and searched Hayes. A thread popped up titled, "Hayes Transfer, Timeline." I clicked it. A message from my mother sent 2 weeks ago filled the screen. "Damon, once this is done. Abigail can't change her mind, right? We need to protect ourselves before she meets some guy and decides to move or erase us from the will. We have to secure this. Damon's response was right below it. Don't worry, Linda. Legally, she won't be able to touch your interest in the property. She's our built-in retirement whether she likes it or not. I felt like I was going to throw up, and I hadn't even touched the tea. The betrayal wasn't accidental, it was strategic. I scrolled down to an attached spreadsheet labeled Closed Deals, Seniors. I opened it. It was a list of names, mostly people over 65. The columns included notes like widowed, no kids, isolated, and cognitive decline. The status column for most read, resolved. I scrolled to the very last row. Hayes Abigail, 29, in progress. I stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in my eyes. Damon had done this before. He was a predator. And my parents weren't just victims, they were the bait, and they had knowingly fed me into the trap. My hands were trembling not from the caffeine, but from the radioactive toxicity of what I was looking at. I needed to know if the names on this spreadsheet were real people or just placeholders in Damon's twisted game of Monopoly. I moved the cursor to row 14, Evelyn Torres, 63, Fort Myers, status, resolved. A quick search on Facebook showed a smiling woman with kind eyes holding a grandkid, but the post stopped 2 years ago. I toggled to a public records site, paid the $5 fee, and found a phone number. I dialed before I could talk myself out of it. The phone rang 4 times. Hello. The voice was wary, tired. Hi, is this Evelyn Torres? I asked. My name is Abigail Hayes. I found your name in a file belonging to a man named Damon Price. The line went dead immediately. I stared at the phone. The reaction told me everything I needed to know. I dialed again. It went to voicemail. I called a 3rd time, desperate. Please, I whispered when she picked up, her silence heavy on the other end. He married my sister. He's in my house right now. I think he's trying to take it from me. Your name is on a list labeled Closed Deals. He's still doing it. Evelyn's voice broke, sounding small and shattered. He told me he was out of the investment game. Over the next 20 minutes, Evelyn unspooled a nightmare that mirrored my own, but darker. Damon hadn't married her, but he had dated her for 6 months. He had charmed her, fixed her gutters, and convinced her that her paid-off house was a dead asset. He talked her into a cash-out refinance to invest in a joint venture. Once the money was in an account he controlled, he vanished. She lost the house to foreclosure a year later. She was renting a studio apartment, now working as a greeter at a superstore. I have police reports, she said, her voice hardening. They said it was a civil matter because I signed the papers, but I have the emails where he promised to pay me back. I'll send you everything. I hung up and called another number from the list, George Lang, 72. A nurse answered and passed the phone to him. George was confused at first, but when I mentioned Damon, he started crying. Damon had convinced him to downsize to a luxury condo that didn't exist, buying George's home for cash at half its value and flipping it 3 weeks later. George was in a state-subsidized assisted living facility now because he couldn't afford anything else. I sat back in the chair, the silence of the house pressing in on me. I wasn't just a daughter being used by her family. I was the latest mark in a predator's long game. My parents weren't just needy, they were accomplices to a serial destroyer of lives. I looked at the folder of forged deeds and then at my own hands. I felt sick, but the fear was gone, replaced by a cold, crystalline rage. The doorbell rang sharp and demanding. I jumped, heart spiking. I checked the peephole. It wasn't Damon, it was my cousin Nathan Carter, still in his sheriff's deputy uniform. I opened the door and he stormed in looking furious. Abby, what the hell? Your mom called me from the ER. She's hysterical. She says you poisoned them. I gave them detox tea, Nathan, I said, my voice flat. They're dehydrated, not poisoned. You can't play God with people's intestines just because you're annoyed they visited, he snapped, taking off his hat and running a hand through his hair. Do you know how bad this looks? She wants to press charges. Let her, I said. But look at this first. I dragged him to the guest room. I pointed to the open laptop, the spreadsheet, the forged deed, and the fresh email from Evelyn containing the PDF of a police report filed 2 years ago. Nathan sighed, annoyed, but he looked. He read the email from my mother about erasing me. He looked at the signature on the deed that wasn't mine. He listened as I played the voicemail George had just left me, sobbing about his lost garden. I watched Nathan's posture change. The annoyance evaporated, replaced by the rigid tension of a cop recognizing a crime scene. He leaned closer to the screen, his jaw working. This isn't a family dispute, he muttered, scrolling through the spreadsheet. This is a pattern. Racketeering. Wire fraud. Elder exploitation. He's done it to dozens of people, Nathan, I said. And my parents are helping him do it to me. Nathan straightened up, his face pale. He looked at me, and I saw the apology in his eyes before he even spoke. This is felony messed up, Abby, like federal prison messed up. He pulled out his phone, but not to call his mom or mine. He dialed a number I didn't recognize. Yeah, it's Carter. Is Detective Milligan on? I need him. Financial crimes. Yeah, it's urgent. I'm at a scene right now with a massive paper trail on a guy we've probably been looking for. He put it on speaker. We laid it out for the detective on the other end, the folder, the forgery, the intent to defraud the victims on the list. The detective's voice was tinny but clear. Do not confront them. Do not touch that folder again. We need to preserve the chain of custody. If he comes back, act normal. Actually, if he comes back, we might be able to catch him in the act of accessing the safe. They're at the hospital, I said. But he'll come back for the laptop. He knows he left it open. Sit tight, the detective said. I'm printing a warrant request right now. We're going to turn your house into a trap. I hung up and looked at Nathan. The room was getting dark as the afternoon faded. You were wrong about one thing, Nathan said quietly. What? You said you were doing this alone, he said, holstering his phone. You're not. I looked out the window. A squad car was already turning the corner, silent, no lights. The war had officially begun. The transformation of my home from a sanctuary into a trap happened with efficient, terrifying speed. By sunset, 2 plainclothes technicians from the sheriff's office had installed pinhole cameras in the hallway and the home office, syncing the feeds directly to a laptop setup in my living room. They adjusted the angles, tested the audio, and then vanished into the shadows of the backyard, leaving me alone with Nathan and the hum of the hard drive. The house felt alien now, charged with a static electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up. We sat in the dark living room, illuminated only by the glow of the monitor. The hours dragged. Every creak of the floorboards, every settling groan of the house sounded like an invasion. I sat with my knees pulled to my chest, a knot of nausea tightening in my stomach. They're going to arrest him here, I whispered, the reality finally sinking in. Nathan, if my parents are involved, if they knew about the fraud, will they go to jail too? Nathan stared at the screen, his face grim in the blue light. If they sign those papers knowingly, maybe. But usually the con man shields himself and lets the victims take the fall. Damon is the target. Your parents? They're just collateral damage he's willing to burn. I feel sick, I admitted. I feel like I'm betraying them. Nathan turned to me, his voice low and firm. You didn't threaten anyone, Abby. You didn't forge signatures. You didn't steal life savings from grandmothers. They threatened your future. They chose this path. You're just turning on the lights. The clock on the wall ticked past 2:00 a.m. The silence was absolute. Then at 2:14 a.m., the motion sensor on the back deck flared red on the screen. My breath hitched. On the monitor, a grainy monochrome figure moved up the steps. He didn't pick the lock. He used a key. A key my mother must have given him from the emergency hook in the kitchen. Damon slipped inside. He was dressed in black, moving with a practiced stealth that was far too professional for a real estate investor. He didn't call out. He didn't turn on a light. He moved through the kitchen and down the hallway, avoiding the one floorboard outside the bathroom that always squeaked. He had studied my house. He headed straight for the office. On the second camera feed, I watched him enter the room and kneel immediately by the closet, where I kept my small fireproof safe. He pulled a stethoscope, an actual stethoscope, from his pocket, pressing it against the safe door, then abandoned it for a heavy pry bar he pulled from his belt. Through the camera's microphone, his voice came through a low, venomous mutter. "You're not taking this away from me, Abby. I've worked too hard. I'm not letting some ungrateful little brat erase me after everything I've done to set this up." He wasn't looking for files to help the family. He was looking to destroy the evidence that proved I owned my own home. He raised the pry bar, ready to force the lock. "Go," Nathan whispered into his radio. The closet door in the office, which I had emptied of coats hours ago, burst open. 2 deputies spilled out flashlights blindingly bright in the small room. "Sheriff's office, hands, show me your hands." The scream was deafening through the laptop speakers. Damon scrambled back, dropping the pry bar shielding his eyes. Red laser dots danced across his black t-shirt. For a second he looked like he might reach for his waistband, but the sheer volume of the shout froze him. "Don't shoot," he yelled, his voice cracking. "I have a key. My wife's sister asked me to secure her documents. This is a misunderstanding." "On the ground. Now!" I watched tremblings as they forced him face down onto my rug. As they cuffed him and patted him down, the misunderstanding theory evaporated. One of the deputies pulled a compact handgun from Damon's waistband. He checked the slide and held it up to the light. The serial number had been filed off. They emptied his pockets. A flash drive labeled "Portfolio," active and pending, and a folded piece of paper. The deputy unfolded it and held it up to the camera evidence log. It was a handwritten checklist. Step 1. Gain trust. Step 2. Gain access. Step 3. Transfer assets. Step 4. Disappear. They hauled him up. As they marched him down the hallway toward the front door, where Nathan and I were waiting, Damon looked up. His eyes locked onto mine. There was no fear in them, only a cold reptile hatred. As he passed me, he leaned in, hissing low enough that only Nathan and I could hear. "You think they'll ever forgive you for this? You just threw your parents under the bus. They'll hate you forever." I looked at him, shaking but standing my ground. I thought of Evelyn losing her home. I thought of George in the assisted living facility. I thought of the rose bushes I had planted out front and how Damon wanted to bulldoze them for a duplex. "They already chose you over me," I said, my voice cutting through the chaos. "I'm just choosing myself." The door slammed behind him. An hour later, the detective stood in my living room, cataloging the evidence. "We're booking him on attempted burglary, possession of an illegal firearm with an altered serial number, and about 12 counts of fraud and elder exploitation based on what we found on the drive. He's not making bail, Ms. Hayes." The next morning, I sat in an interview room at the station giving my formal statement. Through the glass partition that separated the lobby from the secure area, I saw movement. My parents and Riley had arrived. They looked wrecked, pale, disheveled, still wearing yesterday's clothes. They spotted me. I expected concern. I expected confusion. Instead, Riley's face hardened into a mask of pure fury. My mother, tears streaming down her face, pressed her hand against the glass and mouthed the words clearly enough for me to read them perfectly. "How could you do this to us?" I froze, the pen hovering over my statement. The ambush was over, but the war had just drawn its battle lines. The police tape had been removed, but the stain of the previous night's events still hung heavy in the humid air. I was sitting on the couch, the same spot where Damon had spread out his brochures just yesterday, when the knock came. It wasn't the aggressive pounding of an intruder, but the frantic, desperate rapping of people who felt the world collapsing around them. I opened the door. My parents and Riley stood there. The suitcases were gone. The rental car was idling in the driveway. They didn't look like the confident, invasive force that had stormed my home on Friday. They looked shattered. Mark had aged 10 years overnight, his shoulders slumped, his face gray. Riley was shaking her eyes red-rimmed and wild. Linda was already sobbing, a tissue pressed to her mouth. They pushed inside, but the dynamic had shifted. They weren't occupying the space anymore. They were trespassing, and we all knew it. "You ruined him!" Riley spat, her voice cracking as she pointed a manicured finger at my chest. "You ruined his life, Abby. Are you happy he's in a federal holding cell because of you?" "He's in a holding cell because he's a criminal, Riley," I said, standing by the entryway table, keeping distance between us. "And because he brought a gun into my house." "He was protecting us," Linda wailed, dropping onto the ottoman. "We were just trying to survive. We are drowning, Abby. Drowning. Damon offered us a way out. You don't understand what it's like. You're young. You have time to rebuild. We don't. We sacrificed everything for you kids," Mark said, his voice trembling with a mix of grief and rage. "I worked myself into the ground. Your mother gave up her life. And this is how you repay us, by calling the cops on us, by making us accessories to whatever this is. Whatever this is." I repeated, feeling a cold calm settle over me. "It's fraud. It's theft." "You always thought you were better than us," Riley sneered, stepping closer. "Miss Perfect with her little house and her perfect credit score. You'd rather see your own family in handcuffs than share what you have. It's sick." "Share?" I laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "Is that what we're calling it? Let's look at the math, Riley. I've sent Mom and Dad $800 a month for 4 years. I paid for your transmission last Christmas. I ate rice and beans for 3 years to pay off my student loans so I could help you guys when emergencies hit. I didn't hoard this house. I built it, and I built it while carrying all of you on my back." I walked over to the coffee table where the file or a copy of it sat. I picked up the list of names. "Evelyn Torres," I read aloud. "George Lang. These aren't numbers, they are real people. Evelyn is living in a studio apartment because Damon stole her home. George is in a state facility because Damon liquidated his assets. You knew this. I saw the emails. You read his business plan. You signed the papers." "We didn't know he was hurting people," Linda sobbed. "We just thought he was smart." "No," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "You didn't care." I pulled out my phone. I had taken a screenshot of the email I found on Damon's laptop, the one that had turned my stomach. I held it up, but I didn't just show them. I read it, my voice steady and loud in the quiet room. "Once this is done, she can't back out. We need to protect ourselves before she meets someone and decides to move or erase us from the will." I lowered the phone and looked my mother dead in the eye. She flinched, shrinking back into the cushions. "You were so scared I might erase you." I said the words tasting like ash, "that you helped him try to erase me from my own life, from my own home." "Abby, please," Mark pleaded, stepping toward me, hands out. "We're your parents. You can't just throw us away. We made a mistake. We were desperate. You can't let us go down for this." "I didn't throw you away," I said, feeling the final tether snap. "You threw me away the second I stopped being useful to you. I am not your retirement plan. I am not your backup mortgage. I am your daughter, or I was." The room went silent. The air felt thin. "I am cutting off the transfer," I said clearly. "No more checks, no more emergency funds. And I will not lie to the police to protect you. I already gave them the emails. If they charge you, that's on you." Riley let out a scream of pure frustration and lunged at me, her hand raised as if to slap the words out of the air. Before she could make contact, Nathan stepped out from the hallway, his uniform imposing, his hand catching her wrist in midair. "That's assault," Nathan said, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't make me arrest you too, Riley. Get out." Riley yanked her arm back, breathing hard, staring at me with pure hatred. Mark grabbed her shoulder, looking defeated. They turned to the door. As they crossed the threshold, Linda turned back. Her face was a mask of tragic martyrdom. "One day you'll regret this, Abigail. When you're old and alone and nobody cares about your precious house, you'll wish you had your family. You'll see." I looked at them, the people who had raised me, the people who had sold me out for a duplex and a payout. Today, I'm burying the idea that blood lets you hurt me without consequences, I said quietly. That's the only funeral I'm having. Nathan closed the door firmly in their faces. I heard the lock click. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the door, my legs suddenly turning to jelly. A sob ripped through my chest, violent and jagged, but as the tears came, I realized with a jolt that I wasn't crying from loss. I was crying from relief. It has been nearly a year since the flashing lights of the sheriff's cruisers painted my living room walls red and blue, but the silence that inhabits my home now is different. It isn't the heavy, loaded silence of a held breath waiting for the next crisis. It is a clean, sun-drenched silence. It is the sound of peace. The fallout from that night was swift and absolute, dismantling the facade my family had built their lives behind. The federal case against Damon was watertight. Between the firearm charge, the wire fraud, and the mountain of evidence regarding elder exploitation found on his drives, there was no plea deal that could save him. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. The civil suits that followed, led by Evelyn and George's families, stripped away whatever assets he had hidden. He was bankrupt before he even stepped into his cell. My family didn't fare much better. Without Damon's schemes to prop them up, their house of cards collapsed. Riley lost the luxury apartment and the leased SUV within 3 months. I heard through a cousin that she moved into a small rental on the outskirts of Columbus and picked up shifts at a retail chain, forced to actually work for the first time in her adult life. My parents were finally forced to sell their Ohio home, the one they had leveraged to the hilt. They moved into a modest state-subsidized senior complex. They call me occasionally, leaving voicemails that vacillate between guilt-tripping sobs and cold formal requests for contact. I don't delete them, but I don't answer them either. I turned my attention back to the house I sacrificed my 20s to build, the house they tried to steal. I didn't carve off the back lot. I didn't build a rental unit. Instead, I reinvested in stability. I repainted the guest room, erasing the gray tones Damon had favored for a warm, buttery yellow. I replaced the furniture in the living room, getting rid of the stiff, staging-ready pieces for soft, oversized chairs that invited you to stay, not just to look. The biggest change, however, was outside. Along the walkway where Damon had stomped with his heavy boots and where Riley had dragged her suitcases with such entitlement, I tore up the sod. I spent a weekend on my knees digging into the earth, planting a row of hardy white and pink roses. I wanted something beautiful and thorny to grow over the footprints they left. I wanted the path to my door to be lined with life, not leverage. My life expanded beyond the property lines, too. I joined a community group in town that holds workshops for seniors, teaching them how to spot predatory contracts and phishing scams. It felt like penance in a way, but also like armor. I met people like Evelyn there, survivors who refused to be victims. I even started dating again. His name is David, a high school history teacher with a calm voice and no interest in real estate portfolios. We're taking it slow. He knocks before he enters a room. He asks before he pours a drink. He understands that my boundaries are not walls to be breached, but structural supports that keep me standing. I sat down at my desk last week and wrote 2 letters. The first was to Evelyn and George, updating them on the final sentencing and the restitution payments they might eventually see. The second letter was to myself. I listed everything I had survived: the years of financial extraction, the emotional ambush, the attempt to erase me from my own deed. I wrote down the moment I chose to call the police instead of caving in. I burned the letter in the backyard fire pit, watching the smoke curl up into the stars. It felt like the final closing ceremony for a version of Abigail who existed only to serve others. Now I stand on the porch again, just like I did that Friday night before the doorbell rang. The sun is setting, casting that same brilliant orange glow across the water, but I am not the same woman. I hold a mug of coffee, feeling the warmth seep into my fingers. My phone buzzes on the railing. It's a message from Nathan. He sent a picture of his 2 kids grinning at a charity 5K, wearing oversized t-shirts that say Scam Squad. Underneath he wrote, "We're proud of you, cuz." I smile, and it reaches my eyes. This is what family is supposed to feel like. It isn't an obligation or a debt. It is a steady, quiet thing that doesn't ask what you can do for it. My parents tried to turn my life into a safety net they could fall into forever. They tried to cash me out before I even turned 30, viewing me as an asset on a spreadsheet rather than a human being. They ambushed me, they sacrificed me, and they tried to erase me. But they made a critical error in their calculations. They didn't expect me to fight. I look out at the roses blooming along the walkway, their white petals glowing in the twilight. I kept the house. I kept my future. I let the flowers grow over the path they used to walk to hurt me. And for the first time in my life, nobody gets to threaten this peace but me. And so Abigail finally found the peace she fought so hard to protect. It's a stark reminder that family isn't always defined by blood, but by respect. If you enjoyed this story of reclaiming control, please hit that like button and subscribe for more. Let us know how you would have handled this situation in the comments. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.